They said the evidence was gone, turned to ash. They said the story was over, but every fire leaves a trace, and every alibi has a crack. This is Ashes and Alibis, a true crime podcast that sifts through the remains of stories they tried to forget. Because everything burns except the truth. Dorothy Jane Scott was a single mother who vanished from California in 1980 after taking a co-worker to the hospital. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Dorothy had been receiving disturbing anonymous phone calls from a man who claimed to love her, but also threatened to kill her. In 1984, her remains were discovered in a remote area of Anaheim. Despite several leads, her killer has never been identified. This is the story of the stalking, abduction, and murder of Dorothy Jane Scott. 32-year-old Dorothy Jane Scott was a single mother living in Stanton, California in 1980. She was known for her quiet and devout Christian lifestyle. She worked as a secretary for 2 jointly owned stores in Anaheim. One that sold psychedelic items and another, a head shop. They were named Swingers Psych Shop and Custom John's Head Shop. The shops were owned by a man named John 𝐒𝐿, who purchased the businesses from Dorothy's father. Dorothy lived with her aunt and dedicated most of her time to raising her 4-year-old son, Sean. Her son Sean's father is Dennis Terry, who was living in Fairgrove, Missouri at the time. Dorothy didn't speak much about their relationship, but at some point there was tension over custody of Sean. Because Dorothy had full custody of him for the previous 4 years, Dennis asked her for full custody of him for the next 4 years. Dorothy completely rejected this idea, causing an argument between the two of them. Outside of her history with Sean's father, Dorothy's father Jacob said his daughter may have dated on occasion, but had no steady boyfriend. As far as the family knew, Dorothy was known to be a homebody and spend time with her son and family. Her parents, who lived 20 minutes away in Anaheim, would watch Sean while Dorothy worked. In the months leading up to her disappearance, Dorothy began receiving anonymous phone calls both at work and home. The caller, a male voice she recognized but couldn't identify, expressed both affection and threats. He would often express to Dorothy how much he loved her and warned that he was following her and knew everything about her daily routine. In one instance, he told her, "When I get you alone, I will cut you up into bits so no one will ever find you." On another occasion, he instructed her to go outside, where she found a single dead rose on her car's windshield. As the calls escalated, Dorothy became more terrified. These unsettling events prompted Dorothy to consider purchasing a handgun and enroll in karate classes for self-defense. On May 28, 1980, Dorothy was attending a work meeting. Suddenly, one of her co-workers, Conrad Bostrom, appeared unwell with a red mark on his arm. Concerned, she and another colleague, Pam Head, decided to take him to the emergency room at UC Irvine Medical Center. Before heading to the hospital, Dorothy stopped by her parents' house, changing her black scarf to a red one. At the hospital, medical staff confirmed that Conrad had suffered a black widow spider bite and began treatment. According to Pam, her and Dorothy sat in the waiting room together the entire time waiting for their friend. Conrad was eventually discharged around 11 p.m. Before leaving, Conrad waited at the pharmacy for his prescriptions to be filled. Dorothy offered to grab her car and drive it up to the front of the hospital to make it easier for her friends. But, as Pam and Conrad went out to the parking lot to meet Dorothy, they saw her car drive fast out of the parking lot. They waited for her, hoping that she would come back to pick them up. However, when she didn't, they just assumed that Dorothy had an emergency with her son when they did not hear from her after several hours. They became worried and contacted the authorities and reported her missing. Later that night, around 4:30 a.m., authorities found her 1973 Toyota station wagon burning in an alleyway 10 miles away from the hospital. There was no sign of Dorothy or any clues to her whereabouts. The discovery deepened the mystery and heightened fears for her safety. About a week after Dorothy's disappearance, her parents began receiving anonymous phone calls from a man claiming to have Dorothy or stating he had killed her. These calls, occurring almost every Wednesday afternoon, only came in when Dorothy's mother Vera was home alone. In June 1980, a man called the Orange County Register, a local newspaper that had published a story on the case, claiming responsibility for Dorothy's death and stated, "I killed her. I killed Dorothy Scott. She was my love. I caught her cheating with another man. She denied having someone else. I killed her." The caller also provided details that had not been made public, such as the colour of her scarf and the spider bite incident. This led authorities to believe the caller was indeed involved in her disappearance. One evening in April 1984, Jacob, Dorothy's father, answered, and the calls stopped after that. On August 6, 1984, nearly 4 years after her disappearance, partial human remains were discovered by a construction worker about 30 feet from Santa Ana County Road. They included a pelvis, an arm, 2 thighs and a skull. In a weird twist, the remains were found underneath dog remains. Dorothy did not own a dog, nor did she have a dog with her the night she disappeared. The remains were also partly charred, likely due to a bushfire that had swept through the area in 1982. Alongside the remains, a turquoise ring and a watch were found, which Dorothy's mum Vera identified as belonging to her. The watch had stopped at 12:30 a.m., approximately an hour after Dorothy was last seen. Dental records eventually confirmed the remains were Dorothy's. An autopsy could not determine the cause of death, and to this day, no arrests have been made in connection with her murder. After Dorothy's remains were found, the haunting phone calls to her parents started back up. Police tried to trace the calls, but the man never stayed on the line long enough. Sean's father, Dennis Terry, was originally a suspect in the case, but it seems investigators were able to rule him out pretty quickly. As mentioned earlier, he was living out of state at the time of Dorothy's disappearance. At some point, investigators became aware of a suspect by the name of Mike Butler. Mike's sister worked at Swinger's Psych Shop, and he worked at an auto body shop across the street. There have been reports that he was obsessed with Dorothy, but investigators never had enough evidence to consider Mike a viable suspect or person of interest. He passed away in 2014. Investigators also had their eyes on John 𝐾𝐽𝐿𝐴, the owner of the shops where Dorothy worked. It turns out he was arrested years later on federal tax evasion charges. Some people speculate Dorothy may have known about his wrongdoings, and that gave him a motive to kill her. In perhaps just a weird coincidence, John owned the land that Dorothy's remains were found on. There is speculation that Dorothy's case may be connected to the missing person case of Patricia Jean Snyder. Her story begins in the early hours of July 31st, 1982, in Pedley, California. Patricia, affectionately known as Patty, was a 25-year-old cocktail waitress at the Palomino station in Indian Hills. After completing her shift around 3:45 a.m., she stopped at a Circle K convenience store on Limonite Avenue to make a phone call, reporting that her car had broken down. The clerk at the Circle K recalled seeing two sandy-haired Caucasian men in the parking lot during Patty's call. It's unclear if they interacted with her or had any connection to her disappearance. The clerk did not think much about it at the time. Between 5 and 6 a.m., a Riverside County Sheriff's deputy discovered Patty's brown and white 1974 Toyota Celica engulfed in flames in a field near Van Buren Boulevard and Doolittle Avenue. The fire was intentionally set, but there was no trace of Patty. Despite extensive investigations, Patty was never found. Over the years, theories have emerged. Some suggest Patty fell victim to a random act of violence, others believe she was targeted. Discussions on forums like Reddit have attempted to piece together clues, but no definitive answers have surfaced. There is very little information known about Patty and her disappearance, but the similarities between her disappearance and Dorothy's are striking. If you have any information regarding the disappearance of Patricia Jean Schneider, please contact the Riverside Police Department. The case of Dorothy Jane Scott leaves us with numerous unsettling questions. Who was the anonymous caller that tormented Dorothy and her family? What was the motive behind her abduction and murder? Why did the calls to her parents persist even after her remains were found? Despite extensive investigations, these questions remain unanswered and Dorothy's killer has never been brought to justice. Stalking is a pattern of repeated and unwanted attention, harassment, contact or any other course of conduct directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear. A key element of stalking is the feeling of fear, which separates it from things such as harassment. As noted earlier, Dorothy was in fear for her life, and she was contemplating purchasing a gun as well as taking karate lessons. Stalking is often downplayed or misunderstood, but it's a serious and potentially dangerous behavior, as we see in the tragic case of Dorothy. It is important to bring awareness and encourage victims to seek help. You might guess that the majority of stalkers are strangers to the victims, but that's actually not true. Most stalkers are someone that the victim knows, and statistics tend to agree that about 40% of people are stalked by someone they know, such as a current or former intimate partner. Roughly another 40% are stalked by an acquaintance, and only about 10% of victims are stalked by strangers. It's reasonable to guess that Dorothy was more than likely stalked by someone she knew. Her stalker seemed to know intimate details that a stranger most likely would not know. Dorothy Jane Scott's tragic story serves as a haunting reminder of the dangers of stalking and the profound impact it can have on victims and their families. Unfortunately, both of Dorothy's parents have since passed away, never knowing who murdered their daughter. Her case remains unsolved, leaving a void in the hearts of those who knew and loved her. If you have any information regarding the murder of Dorothy Jane Scott, please contact the Orange County Sheriff's Department. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Ashes and Alibis. Please subscribe for more deep dives into unsolved mysteries, updates on current cases, and more true crime and bullshit. Stay tuned for our next episode.